we call to order the Court of Gaming Opinion. This judicial system's purpose is clear, to evaluate the arguments and merits behind the judging of games, whether it be through the press or through the player base as a whole. The prosecution will represent the court of the popular opinion in question, make the arguments of why the game is being accused for that day, while the defense's job is simple, counter that argument. Each side can present evidence to support their claims, as well as bring in other games as overall examples for their arguments. The defendant today is Abyss Odyssey, the 2014 roguelike action game that came out to mixed reception in the gaming community. Prosecution, please make your opening argument.
Thank you, Your Honor. Let us begin. It's clear that the developers of Ace Team attempted to bring their spin to the roguelike and action genre with Abyss Odyssey, but failed to understand what made the genre good in the first place. They're diving into alternate mechanics like in games such as Xenoclash had served them well in the past, but it's hard to argue with an overall score of 69 on Metacritic. And with only 2/3 of the Steam community giving it a recommendation, a community that usually is favorable to smaller indie games, it's clear that its place in the gaming world has been sealed. For a $15 price tag, it didn't meet the requirements of a good chunk of gamers, and deserves the low score that it has today.
Well said. Defense?
Thank you, Your Honor. The prosecution's insistence on using Metacritic as a reference does not highlight the fact that the game did score high with several critics, and as gaming has shown, one man's favorite game can be another's horrible, horrible experience. What is on the surface a beautifully crafted game in Abyss Odyssey lies a game that can be misunderstood when compared against games of a similar nature. I believe that the expectations of those who bought the game on similar experiences of the past is the root cause of the lower score here, and that while it may not be for everyone, the faults leveled at the game have fundamental flaws with them, as I will present today. Needless to say, it is of the defense's opinion that the game is a perfect pickup, as it's currently part of the Humble Jumbo Bundle 5, which goes on for the next week.
Very well. Opening arguments are finished. Let's hear the first evidence presented by the plaintiff.
We, the gaming state, present the controls as a major factor for the problems of Abyss Odyssey. The true nature of the controls bring forward a game that is unresponsive. In an action-oriented game, this is a major sin. Every move that the character takes feels like weights have been put on each of their limbs, as they barely respond to the player's controls in question. In the end, it's stiff, and need a layer of oil in the joints to iron out the problems that it has. And considering those controls make up the most unique aspect of gaming, apart from other mediums such as movies, it is one of the main reasons for the failure of Abyss Odyssey. Furthermore,
Objection!
The defense points to Exhibit HR1, gameplay of a game genre that you may not expect to defend Abyss Odyssey, the horror genre, because the best examples of the genre point to where my main defense is coming from, the design of the controls. I present the idea that the controls in Abyss Odyssey are crafted specifically with the limitations in mind, to take specific control away from the player in certain elements. In other words, they were designed to complement the game experience, and that the expectation of mere other good games in the genre have blinded the plaintiffs from seeing the true value in the game. One of the biggest problems that I've seen over the past couple years is that everyone, and I mean everyone, wants a game to control like Shovel Knight or a Rogue Legacy in terms of responsiveness. But people forget that at times, that holding back controls can help a game experience as well, and that's the exact case with Abyss Odyssey, as well as some of the best horror games in question. The defense does not refute that the controls are heavy with Abyss Odyssey, but I argue that is exactly what the game needed. The defense would like to present Exhibit 1B as evidence, one of the themes of Abyss Odyssey, the idea of consequence. You can see it in various parts of the main storyline, but even in the branching sections as well. You'll repeatedly come across soldiers with mortal wounds because they got too greedy or too thick-headed and they were punished appropriately. Basically, they took too much risk and they paid for it. In the game, once you go down a specific path or action, you will get your ass handed to you if it wasn't the right decision. And this directly ties with the implementation of the controls. The game was designed specifically to restrict the movement and your ability to turn. Turning is a specific action in this game, In other games, that's not the case, it's just part of the process. But in Abyss Odyssey, in order to turn to face the other wall, for example, you can't jump and turn in mid-flight. You have to first turn around and then jump. The core idea here is that when you take an action in this game, you need to realize where your character is and what his current state is. Unlike other games of the genre, where you can literally speed jump without any issues from a standing position, Abyss Odyssey makes it clear that what you're doing now and what your character is doing now makes a huge difference. Every action must have a purpose, and if you try to do too much at once, you'll end up in trouble. If the controls allowed for more reaction time and more finite control, the punishment in question would be far less, and it wouldn't complement the combat of the game.
Objection!
Come on now, you know that's a bad defense. Does that mean all controls are fine regardless? That stiff controls are fine because that's what the programmers wanted? I'd like to see you make that argument against Sonic Boom.
Hold it!
No, you don't understand my point. It's not the fact that the controls are stiff by itself. It's the fact that the controls are stiff, and that complements the enemies and the combat as well. Now let's say for the sake of argument the game had the controls that Rogue Legacy did, for the sake of your point. You'd find that the game was a breeze. Why? Because the specific elements that make up the combat, the natural action and reaction flow the combat had would be broken, as you could easily interrupt enemies and react to things too quickly. The give and take of the current combo system would be a lot easier to pull off in most cases, and that's not what the game was going for, as I will allude to later on in this trial.
Objection!
That aside, surely you can't deny the fact that the game has a problem with the use of keyboard controls, right? The defense admits that yes, the game is much easier and was designed to be played with a controller, that much is clear. But the defense did play with the keyboard controls, and doesn't see the problem here, at least when reconfiguring via bindable keys. The mouse and keyboard setup as presented by the developers at the start is not only odd, but it's just plain strange. But thanks to rebindable keys, you can make it strictly keyboard, which works a lot better. Movement isn't clunky either with the lack of a control stick either, surprisingly. It still responds well, and seems to be less about the keyboard in question and more about the movement style in question, at least in my opinion. Thank you for leading into my next argument. Your arguments about controls aside, the movement in a game where platforming is necessary should be pointed out as a point against the game's reputation. There are jumps present in the game that not only take multiple attempts, but can be so hard to execute that the player wonders if the game has created an unwinnable scenario. There will be times you think you should have grabbed a ledge only to wildly miss. Controls aside, the main playable character plays with the mobility of an incapacitated seal.
Objection!
Isn't any incapacitated creature of any sort unable to move?
Objection!
You know what I'm getting at, right? Actually, I do, but I don't agree. I think the plaintiff is holding over his complaints from the controls portion of his first argument, but let's address this specifically. I present the following gameplay evidence of my time with the game. Let's watch me move through the map here. Remember, the character in question is supposed to be, and I quote, has all the mobility of an incapacitated seal. Does this look like a clubbed seal to you? That's one of the most reasonably moving seals I've seen in a while, if that's the case. A lot of the problems thrown against Abyss Odyssey is simple. It's lacking specifics about what the problem is, but I'm guessing it's less to do about the horizontal movement, because once you get running and all, things flow as you see here. But no, some people did point out specifically the issue at hand, the vertical portion of the game, and in particular, segments are pointed out regarding the double jump mechanics. Thanks for making my point for me. The plaintiffs do have some reasonable points here, I will admit that. Some jumps in question can be very tricky, as they force you to go to the edge of the double jump's height to grab a platform, and that's specifically compounded with the second character mechanic. When you die in the game, you aren't out of the game just yet. A generic soldier comes to take your place, and his abilities aren't as strong as the original character. It makes sense from a storyline perspective, but it then screws with your control expectations. You're expecting the controls to react the same way as before, but now you've got someone less qualified, and you're struggling. This sudden shift in ability is a point that I'll give to the plaintiffs. It causes a problem at the core of the game, despite the uniqueness of the mechanic. So you succeed the overall point, I guess. Not at all. When it comes to the actual overall movement of the game, at the core, this is a matter of preference from the prosecution in terms of expectations. People came into this game expecting an experience like, I'll say it again, Rogue Legacy, and the fluid movement options that game presents. This game is not Rogue Legacy. Instead, it serves as a counterpoint to it, something where movement is less emphasized, and the game only has you dealing with platforming challenges on a small basis. This is something the player has to adjust to, as once you get over that first hour of clunkiness, as you call it, the game will feel like it's doing the job in terms of the movement portion. You have to adjust. The defense believes that the free weekend that the game had a while ago actually hurt its overall score, due to players trying the game quickly, not getting used to it, and not giving it the time that a purchased game would deserve.
Objection!
Are you blaming the free weekend and the people who played it and tried it for its review score?
Hold it!
No. The decision to grow the player base using the free weekend is on the developers. It wasn't helped by the comparison to fighting games in the store description, however, despite it being reasonable in some ways. This may have been an adapt comparison to games of fighting past, like old Tekken games, but new fighting games such as Skullgirls have a lot more smooth and fast-paced action in mind, which is not what Abyss Odyssey is at its core, and it set up bad expectations. However, my point is this. If the game had movements specifically designed to be more mobile, it'd ruin the combat specifically in question. It would hurt the give and take in which you could punish the opponent in the long run, and it's clear that more emphasis was put on the combat portion than the platforming portion of this game. While you can hold it against the platforming sections, of course, I'd argue that its commitment to the combat mechanics is exactly why the movement needs to be slower and more methodical, or the combat would be too one-sided and cause major problems for difficulty for the player. You do a very good job of setting up my next points, Mr. Wright. Because combat is the third witness I'll call for this game's judgment. Movement problems aside, the combat itself is slow and unwieldy as mentioned before, but it doesn't help that the moveset and attacks you have feels like they don't have the power behind them, and that's if you actually execute the attacks in a reasonable amount of time, as the attacks are too long and can't be broken out of. The pace is so slow that it would bore even the most laid back of players. Even with extra characters to unlock aside, the hitbox seems to be inaccurate, and the AI is too advanced at times for players to deal with multiple enemies at a time, especially in the hard sections of the game. Needless to say, it's a combat system that is slow and boring, and in a game labeled action, it's sort of pathetic.
Objection!
But that's not the point of this combat. See, this combat isn't supposed to be the Street Fighter, nor the Rogue Legacy, nor even the Super Smash Bros. That I see it compared to. Combat systems have to play to the strength of the gameplay, and the enemies and the environment here wasn't set up to play as a fast brawler. You aren't supposed to be Yoda from the Star Wars series, jumping around like a Mexican jumping bean. No, the best example I can use to describe what the fighting in Abyss Odyssey is supposed to be like is simple. Fencing. Each move in fencing serves a purpose, and in particular, it's very important regarding setting yourself up for a follow-up attack, or even strikes that are for defensive purposes in terms of swordplay. If you look at popularized sword fights in movies and anime, you'll get the impression that blades are supposed to be thrown around willy-nilly. But that's not the case in fencing. Your attacks are supposed to be pointed, and one wrong move can be punished very, very easily. And that's exactly what Abyss Odyssey is going for. Sure, you can still get through a couple of fights without thought, but the game will punish you for it eventually. The attacks are slow for that very reason. They are punishable like you'd see in fighting game mechanics, hence the comparison. If they were to be faster, the enemy's attacks and animations as designed, they wouldn't work. This combat is supposed to be slower, and you're supposed to feel the impact of every button press you make. This game can easily punish you for button mashing. But what it can do is reward precision strikes and moves that flow into one another. You'll notice in the gameplay showed here that I like taking to the air with the female fencer that I won't try to pronounce the name of, and there's a reason for that. I liked forcing the enemy to react to the overhead attack, because a lot of her special attacks could punish it if followed up properly. See, the combat's more in-depth than some people give it credit for. It's just in the combinations of enemies, locations, and your current skill set in where the variety comes from. Its small moveset at times is coupled by defensive guarding, dodging, and specifically timing that can make the combat exciting. Your weapon's range makes a huge difference, as where you hit an enemy can be as important as where you don't. Getting too close to an enemy can actually make you miss, which is uncharacteristic of some games in the genre. Grabbing has much more of an emphasis due to its close quarter nature and the ability to combo into it, but also due to the use of guarding as a mechanic. It's all about specific precision, and that's what makes Abyss Odyssey stand out in the end. And the precision would be lessened if some of the main complaints as presented here by the plaintiff were addressed.
Okay. I believe this wraps up the evidence in question. Let's move to the closing arguments.
The prosecution believes that the presented faults of Abyss Odyssey is exactly why it's got its mixed reaction. Is it the worst game of all time? No, not at all. In fact, one might argue that 2/3 of the player base liking the game would normally be a positive rating than a mixed rating. But the defense seems to believe that the game's purposeful design is the reason for the review problems that the game has. But isn't that just a sign of just problems with the game? Sure, some will always love a game and some will hate it, but it's clear that the game deserves its rating on Steam based on its problems. Some people just can't handle it. The defense does admit that Abyss Odyssey does have several flaws that hold it back, but the majority of evidence that has been presented for the sake of its Steam review score is flimsy on the surface. The game does have problems that some have alluded to. For a procedurally generated game, for example, there's too little variety that happens with maps in the long run, and the game's combat, while refreshing in the genre, can wear over time, especially as it doesn't present you with an equal and opposite challenge as you level up your character. However, the defense does believe that this is a game that deserves Steam users' time, and that the bigger issue is the expectations that some had for the game. That can be put on the marketing of the game, but it's a case of looking at beyond the review score and beyond the marketing. Many of the positive reviews understand what the game was truly going for in the end. Many games of this genre play relatively the same, and the defense believes that Abyss Odyssey is a great example of twisting the formula up in a way to make it feel a bit refreshing. Things like its purposeful movement help it rather than hurt it, despite the claims of stiff controls from the prosecution. It makes a game that plays a bit more strategic and rewards smart and flowing move combos rather than rewarding kinetic gameplay. There are valid cases of movement that do have issues, but people comparing the game to games like Smash put the game in the wrong audience in mind. It's most definitely worth a purchase in the Humble Bundle pack, and even can justify its normal $15 price tag for action platform gamers who want something completely different.
Thank you both. It's now time to ask the jury to make a determination in the case of this game. Does Abyss Odyssey seem worth your time, or does the evidence presented not support the theory in question? Leave your comments about it so the ballots can be tallied, and ideas for other games that may need to be defended from the might that is the swarm of gamers out there.
Hey everybody, thanks for watching. If you like this content and want to see more of it, you may want to hit that subscribe button on the left hand side. If you like this video and want to see more of this content, take a look at this video on the left hand side as well. And if you missed my last video, take a look at the right hand side. Once again, thanks for watching, and keep on gaming.